She dropped her tray, and the entire dining hall laughed. A quiet woman in a plain uniform, no rank, no decorations, sitting alone in the corner like she didn't belong anywhere near soldiers with real careers. Sergeant Knox made sure everyone saw it, made sure everyone remembered her face. He had no idea that face had been on classified briefings in 3 countries, that the hands he'd just humiliated had pulled men out of burning buildings under live fire, that the woman he chose to destroy was the one person on this base with the authority to end him. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Subscribe right now and follow this story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next, or any of the stories coming after this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what's coming, it'll change how you look at every quiet person in the room. The mess hall at Redstone Valley came alive every morning the same way a machine came alive. Not because anything beautiful was happening, but because it had no choice. Steam vents hissed above the serving line. The overhead fluorescents buzzed at a frequency that after 3 weeks on base, soldiers stopped noticing. Boots hit sealed concrete in overlapping rhythms, squeak, thud, drag, and underneath all of it ran the low, constant hum of 300 people eating, arguing, laughing, surviving another morning in a place that didn't care whether you slept well or not. It smelled like burnt coffee, scrambled eggs cooked 40 minutes too long, an industrial cleaner that never quite masked the grease baked into the floor tiles after years of high-volume use. Private Danny Reyes always sat near the west windows. Not for the view, the windows faced a vehicle depot, but because nobody senior sat there. Nobody with the authority to pull him into a conversation he wasn't ready to have at 6 in the morning. He was 22 years old, 14 months into his service, and he had learned early that the safest seat in any military dining facility was the one nobody powerful wanted. He was scraping the last of his eggs when he noticed her. She came in through the east entrance, which was unusual. Most soldiers filtered in from the barracks corridor on the north side. The east entrance connected to the administrative processing wing, a limbo space for transfers, temporary assignments, and personnel waiting on paperwork that hadn't caught up to them yet. She carried her tray with both hands and walked the serving line without making eye contact with anyone. Medium height, dark hair pulled back with regulation precision. Her uniform was clean but worn, not shabby, just used. The kind of uniform that had been washed too many times in base laundry facilities and had lost the rigid sharpness of something recently issued. Her name tag said Morgan. Below it, logistics specialist. No unit patch. No awards. A single ribbon bar with nothing that made anyone look twice. She chose a table in the far corner, the one that collected trays people left behind, and sat with her back to the wall facing the room. She had a small green notebook, spiral-bound, the kind that cost $1 at any base exchange. She opened it and began writing while eating, never looking up. Danny watched her for exactly 4 seconds before his attention got pulled elsewhere. He didn't think about her again until the sound. At 06:23, Sergeant First Class Tyler Knox came through the north entrance the way he came through most spaces, like he'd already decided the room owed him something. Knox was built for intimidation the way some vehicles were built for off-road terrain, wide, heavy, and capable of doing significant damage to anything that didn't move out of the way in time. He had 11 years in, 3 commendations he referenced constantly, and a reputation on base that depended entirely on whether you were someone he respected or someone he decided to perform for. He respected very few people. He performed constantly. Behind him came Corporal Marcus Webb and PFC Jordan Stills, 2 younger soldiers who had figured out that orbiting Knox was easier than having opinions of their own. They moved the way acolytes moved, slightly behind, slightly angled, always watching his face for the cue that told them what to think. Knox scanned the dining hall as he filled his tray. That was the tell. When Knox scanned a room, he wasn't looking for a place to sit. He was looking for material. He found it in 30 seconds. "Who is that?" Webb followed his sightline. "Don't know her, Sergeant. East entrance." "Logistics patch." Knox's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "No unit, no awards." He picked up his coffee. "What's she doing in the senior section?" The table Claire Morgan had chosen wasn't formally designated for senior personnel. But it was understood, the way most things on a military base were understood without being written down, that the corner tables near the south wall were where senior NCOs and officers ate. Not because of a rule, because of years of unspoken social architecture that new people were expected to figure out by watching. A logistics specialist with no unit patch, eating alone, not watching the room for social cues, that read to Tyler Knox like an invitation. He picked up his tray and walked toward her. Well, Danny Reyes saw it happen. He noticed Knox change direction, noticed Webb and Stills exchange a look, the quick, complicit kind that meant here we go, and fall into step behind their sergeant. Danny put his fork down slowly. The way you put things down slowly when you know something's about to happen and you're not sure whether to watch or look away. Knox stopped at Claire Morgan's table. She didn't look up. Hey! Knox set his tray down on the table beside hers, not joining her, just occupying adjacent space the way a wall occupies a doorway. You lost? Claire's pen kept moving across the page of her notebook. She finished a sentence, then she looked up. No. Because this section's not really... Knox glanced around with the theatrical uncertainty of someone who knows exactly what he's about to say. For every rank, you know what I mean? I know what you mean. You process in yesterday, East Wing? Yes. So you're new. He said it like new was a diagnosis. What unit are you waiting on? Waiting on reassignment paperwork. Knox nodded slowly, studying her name tag, her ribbon bar, the worn edges of her uniform. Logistics, huh? He pulled out the chair across from her and sat without being invited. Webb and Stills positioned themselves slightly behind him, flanking without engaging. Long way from the supply office. Claire looked at him steadily. Not aggressively, not nervously, the way you look at a problem you're running calculations on. I'm eating breakfast, she said. I can see that. Knox picked up his own fork. Just making conversation, being friendly. You know, some people come through this base not understanding how things work here, how things are structured. He let that sit for a second. I like to make sure people get oriented correctly. I appreciate that. You from a forward unit? You look like you've had some field time. Some. Knox waited for more. She didn't give him more. He set down his fork. What's your MOS again? Logistics? That's supply chain, distribution, procurement, right? You a desk job? The table nearest to them had gone quiet. Two staff sergeants who'd been talking about a football game had stopped. Not conspicuously. They were still facing each other, but their forks weren't moving. Claire closed her notebook. Sergeant, she said, I'm going to finish eating and get back to the admin wing. I have paperwork. I'm sure you do. Knox leaned forward slightly. But here's the thing. People in this facility have a certain... He searched for the word with the expression of someone performing thoughtfulness. Earned respect for the space. You understand? Some of us have been here long enough that we know who belongs where. And a logistics specialist with no unit patch eating in the senior section at 00600 while scribbling in a notebook. He gestured at the green notebook with his fork. That doesn't really fit. Silence was spreading outward from their table, the way cold spreads through a room when someone leaves a door open. It moved in concentric rings. It's just breakfast, she said. Right. Knox smiled. Sure it is. He stood up, and for a moment Danny Reyes thought it was over. He thought Knox had made his point and was walking away. Then Knox's elbow caught the edge of Claire Morgan's tray. The tray tilted. Coffee went first. A spreading dark bloom across the white surface, and then the plate slid, and the whole thing came off the table edge and hit the floor with the specific percussive crash that only a military cafeteria tray produces. Loud, flat, resonant, impossible to ignore. 300 people heard it. 300 people looked. Laughter started on the east side and moved west within 2 seconds. Not everyone laughed. Danny Reyes didn't laugh, and neither did the two staff sergeants near the south wall. But enough did that it filled the room. The particular laugh of people who've identified someone as outside the group and feel safe saying so. Knox didn't apologize. He looked down at the scattered food and then back at Claire, and he shrugged the way people shrug when they've done something deliberately and want to frame it as an accident. Might want to be more careful, he said. Clumsy this early, you'll have a rough day. Webb exhaled a short laugh. Stills grinned at his tray. Claire looked down at the mess on the floor. Then she stood up. There was no dramatic pause, no slow-motion moment of revelation. She simply stood up, reached down, and began collecting the scattered pieces of her breakfast from the floor with the calm, methodical efficiency of someone completing a task they'd been assigned. The movements were practiced and contained. She wasn't shaking. Her jaw wasn't tight. She looked like someone doing something unremarkable. Knox watched her crouch and collect and felt the room watching him, which was exactly what he wanted. And then she stood back up, tray in hand, and started to walk toward the tray return station at the west wall. Knox stepped into her path. It wasn't aggressive, technically. He just moved into the space between her and where she was going and let his size do the work that his words had been doing. It was the kind of physical conversation that happened without words, the kind that said, "I'm not done with you yet." Claire stopped. She looked at the tray in her hands. She looked at Knox in front of her. The room had gone church quiet. "Sergeant," she said, and her voice was very level. "I need to get to the tray return." "Sure you do." Knox didn't move. He crossed his arms. "Just thought we weren't finished with our conversation." "We were." "I don't think—" What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. Not because it was slow, because it was fast enough that Danny Reyes's brain needed to replay it multiple times to understand what he'd seen. Knox moved forward, not violently, but with the kind of pressure that was meant to reinforce the physical claim to space. His right shoulder dropped and advanced. Claire's tray hit the adjacent table. Not dropped, placed, fast and precise, clearing her hands. And then she turned, and her body did something that wasn't quite what Danny Reyes's eyes expected from a woman who'd been standing still a moment before. She shifted her weight to her outside foot. Her left hand came up and intercepted Knox's advancing arm, not stopping it, redirecting it, using the momentum he was already generating. And then she turned inside his reach, in a motion that was low and controlled and very deliberate, and Knox's own forward motion carried him into a position he had not chosen and could not immediately correct. He didn't fall. She didn't throw him. It was more precise than that and less spectacular. His wrist was behind his back, his shoulder was at an angle that caused him to bend involuntarily at the waist, and Claire Morgan was behind him with one hand on the back of his collar and one guiding that wrist, and she held him there for exactly long enough to let him understand the geometry of what had just happened. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then she let go and stepped back and picked her tray up from the adjacent table. Knox straightened. His face was a color it hadn't been before. Nobody laughed. Nobody made any sound at all. Danny Reyes was aware that his mouth was open. He closed it. The 2 staff sergeants near the south wall were not looking at each other anymore. They were looking at Claire Morgan. One of them had put down her coffee very slowly, and her expression was something Danny couldn't quite read. Not shock, exactly. More like recognition, like she'd seen something before that she was seeing again. Claire Morgan walked to the tray return station, deposited her tray, picked up her green notebook from the table on the way out, and left through the east entrance. The door swung shut behind her. The mess hall remained silent for another 5 full seconds. Then the noise came back, but it was different noise, lower, unsettled. The sound of 300 people trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed and what it meant about the woman who'd just walked out. Knox was still standing in the middle of the floor, and his face had passed through red into something tighter and harder. Webb said, very quietly, "Sergeant." "Shut up," Knox said. He picked up his tray and walked back to his table and sat down. And he didn't look at anyone, and nobody looked at him. But Danny Reyes looked at the east door. And he kept thinking about her hands, the way they moved like she'd rehearsed this, like she'd spent years rehearsing it, like the scenario of someone stepping into her path was a problem she had solved so many times it had become reflex. The kind of reflex you didn't develop behind a supply desk, the kind you developed somewhere else entirely. The admin wing smelled different from the rest of the base. Carpet instead of sealed concrete, recycled air with too much printer toner in it, the mechanical click of keyboards and the rolling squeak of office chairs, and the particular silence that bureaucratic spaces generated. Not peaceful silence, but the silence of people trying to look busy without revealing how much of their morning had been wasted. Specialist Anita Collier, who processed incoming transfers and handled the initial documentation for personnel on temporary assignment, had been doing her job for 4 years and had developed a reliable sixth sense for the categories of people who came through her office. There were the confident ones who didn't know what they didn't know. There were the nervous ones who'd been transferred for reasons they were still figuring out. There were the bureaucratic ones who came armed with forms and wanted to ensure every box was checked in the correct order. And then occasionally there were the quiet ones who sat in the chair across from her desk and gave her very little to work with and somehow, in doing so, revealed more than anyone else. Claire Morgan was the quiet kind. She'd come in, sat down, and handed over a manila envelope containing her transfer orders. Collier had taken it, opened it, and, out of professional habit, begun scanning the contents. She got through the first page and stopped. "Can I—" She looked up. "Your orders are— these are classified." "I know. I don't—" Collier glanced back at the page, then at the woman sitting across from her. "I don't have the clearance to process all of this." "I know that too," Claire said. "There's a separate packet for Commander Holloway. It's behind the main orders. You don't need to review it." Collier found the sealed secondary envelope. It had a classification stamp she recognized and a distribution code she had never seen in 4 years of processing. She set it carefully to one side. "Okay," she said. "My visible assignment is logistics specialist. The documentation reflects that." "Right." Collier looked at the name tag again. "Morgan. And while you're here on base, you're in logistics?" "Yes." A pause. Collier had processed enough temporary assignments to know when she was being told exactly as much as she was meant to know. "How long will you be with us?" she asked. "That's TBD." "Of course it is." Collier started filling in the intake forms. "Do you need base housing or officer quarters if there's availability? If not, the visiting personnel block is fine." Collier's fingers paused on the keyboard. Officer quarters. A logistics specialist requesting officer quarters. Standard practice would be to redirect that request based on apparent rank. But the sealed envelope sitting at the edge of her desk was making her not want to do standard practice. "I'll check availability," she said, and kept typing. The story spread through the vehicle depot by late morning. Military bases were closed systems with high information velocity. Something that happened in the dining hall at 0623 could reach the motor pool by 0900 and the armory by 1000, and by 1100 it was circulating through the vehicle depot in 3 different versions, each one slightly adjusted by whoever was telling it. In version 1, Knox's version, which Webb was distributing, Claire Morgan was a civilian contractor who'd wandered into the wrong part of the dining facility and attacked an NCO when confronted about it. In version 2, the version that came from the 2 staff sergeants at the south wall, a logistics transfer had put Knox on the floor in 4 seconds without spilling anything. In version 3, Danny Reyes' version, which he was not actively sharing but which was leaking out of him anyway through his expression and the way he answered questions about it, something had happened that didn't fit any of the categories he had for understanding what soldiers looked like. Specialist Marcus Gallo, who'd been working in the depot's scheduling office since 0700, heard all 3 versions by 1045. "So which one is it?" he asked Danny, who had come in for vehicle assignment paperwork. "I don't know what it is," Danny said honestly. "You were there." "Yeah." Danny signed the bottom of the form. "I was there and I still don't know what it is." Gallo looked at him. "Was she military? Like actually military?" Danny thought about her hands. The green notebook, the way she'd sat with her back to the wall facing the room, the way the tray had been placed, not dropped, on the adjacent table before she moved. "I think so," he said. "Yeah, I think so." "What unit?" "That's the thing." Danny picked up his copy of the form. "No unit patch, just a name tag." Gallo was quiet for a moment. "You know what that usually means." "I know what it can mean." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that soldiers with no unit patches and classified transfer orders and the kind of movement efficiency that came from somewhere very specific were not common, and when they appeared on a base without announcement, it was usually for a reason. Knox is saying he's going to file a complaint, Gallo said. I figured. Says she assaulted him. Danny looked out the window of the scheduling office at the rows of vehicles in the depot. He was quiet for a long moment. He walked into her, he said finally. She redirected. That's not how he's telling it. No, Danny said. I don't imagine it is. The supply chain office occupied a long rectangular room on the second floor of the logistics building, divided into 2 rows of workstations facing each other across a central aisle. Whiteboards covered 2 walls. A tracking monitor on the east wall displayed base-wide supply chain status in real time, inventory levels, shipment ETAs, flag delays. Captain Roy Saunders ran the office. He was 41, competent enough, and had a deep institutional trust in process. When Claire Morgan appeared in the doorway of his office at 14:05 with a clipboard and a request to work alongside the coordination team, while her reassignment processed, he'd looked at her temporary duty orders and said yes without thinking much about it. She was quiet. She found an empty workstation at the end of the second row and logged in with the access codes on her paperwork and began reviewing files. Nobody paid attention to her for 45 minutes. At 14:52, Lieutenant Kara Yates pushed back from her station and said, loud enough for the room to hear, I cannot figure out where this delay is coming from. The system shows everything cleared, but the Northeast Depot is still 3 days behind on emergency rations, and no one at the distribution hub is flagging it as a hold. It's been like that for 3 weeks, said Staff Sergeant Paul Diaz from across the room. Saunders sent 2 inquiries up the chain. I know, I drafted both of them. Yates rubbed her forehead. And the responses just keep referencing a coordination update that apparently went out 2 months ago, but that nobody in this office has a copy of. A pause. Check the receiving log for the week of the 14th, Claire said, without looking up from her screen. Not the dispatch records, the receiving log. Specifically the secondary authorization column. Yates looked over at her. The room looked over at her. Sorry? Yates said. Claire's eyes moved to the tracking monitor on the east wall. The coordination update you're referencing. It amended the secondary authorization requirement for emergency ration shipments to forward deployed positions. Any shipment above a certain threshold needs 2-tier sign-off before it clears the distribution hub. But the update only went to hub administrators, not to base receiving teams. So the receiving log here is logging arrival correctly, but the hub is holding the shipments because it never sees the second authorization come back. The shipments are stuck in the middle. The room was quiet. The secondary authorization form is a DD 1348 addendum, revised, Claire continued. If you have Saunders submit it retroactively for the last 3 weeks of held shipments with the amendment reference number from the 14th coordination update. The hub should release everything within 48 hours. More quiet. Yates turned to Diaz. Diaz turned to his screen and started pulling files. He found the receiving log. He found the secondary authorization column. He scrolled to the week of the 14th. Oh my God, he said softly. Yates got up and came around to look at his screen. 3 weeks of held emergency ration shipments, clearly visible once you knew where to look. A documentation gap so specific and so invisible in the standard view that 2 layers of inquiry up the chain of command had missed it. How did you... Yates turned to look at Claire, who had gone back to her screen. How did you know that? I've seen it before, Claire said. Where? A small beat. Different base? She said. Similar system. Captain Saunders had appeared in the doorway of his office during the last 30 seconds of this exchange. He stood there with his coffee mug and watched Diaz pull up the DD 1348 addendum on his screen, then looked at Claire Morgan at the end of the second row, then looked at the tracking monitor showing 3 weeks of held emergency rations. He thought about the transfer orders he'd barely glanced at. He went back into his office and pulled them out of his in-tray and read them more carefully this time. He read them twice. When he came back out, Claire was still at her workstation, working through another file on her screen, and she didn't look up, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression nobody in the room could quite interpret. Then he went back to his desk and quietly called Commander Holloway's office. Danny Reyes was walking back from a late afternoon briefing when he almost walked into Claire Morgan coming around the corner of the east corridor. He stopped. She stopped. They stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway for a beat. "Private," she said with a slight nod. Not warm, not cold. The acknowledgement of a person passing another person in a corridor. "Specialist Morgan." He hesitated. Then, because he was 22 and hadn't yet developed the military discipline of leaving things alone, he said, "That thing in the dining hall this morning." She waited. He stopped. "I want you to know, I wasn't laughing. Some of them were. I wasn't." She looked at him for a moment, not gratefully, not indifferently, with a kind of focus that made him feel like she was reading something more than his face. "I know," she said. He wasn't sure if that was true or if she was being kind, and he also wasn't sure which one he wanted it to be. "Knox is saying he's going to file a complaint," he said. "He probably will." "You're not—" Danny stopped himself. "Sorry, that's not my business." "What were you going to ask?" He shook his head. "Nothing, it's fine. Private." He looked at her. "Say it." He took a breath. "You're not worried about it?" She tilted her head slightly, not mocking, like she was genuinely considering the question. "No," she said. "I'm not." And the way she said it, not brave, not dismissive, just matter of fact, like a person who had run the calculation and arrived at a result she was confident in, made Danny Reyes feel, for the first time that day, like he was standing next to someone standing on very solid ground. "Okay," he said. She walked past him down the corridor and he watched her go, and he thought again about the tray. Placed, not dropped, and the 4 seconds, and the green notebook. And he thought about the receiving log, and about the receiving log, and the 2-tier authorization, and the 3 weeks of held emergency rations that an entire coordination office had failed to locate until a logistics specialist with no unit patch and a worn uniform had found it in 45 minutes. He turned and walked the other direction, and the corridor lights buzzed above him, and somewhere in the back of his mind a question was forming that he didn't have the language for yet. Knox's complaint was drafted by 2,000 hours. He sat at the desk in his room with the lamp on and went through it twice. His handwriting was large and deliberate, and the accusations were specific. Unprovoked physical contact, insubordination, improper use of restricted dining facility, conduct unbecoming. He'd gotten 3 signatures already, Webb, Stills, and a junior corporal from the North Barracks who hadn't been anywhere near the dining hall but who'd heard the Webb version of events, and signed without asking too many questions. Knox looked at the document. He felt the familiar satisfaction of having transformed humiliation into bureaucracy. He'd done it before. The military was a world where paper moved faster than memory, and if you filed first, you defined the story. A logistics specialist, new to the base, no political capital, no unit backing, no visible rank to hide behind. This was not complicated. He slid the complaint into a manila envelope and sealed it, and wrote Command Office, ATTN, Commander, Holloway, on the front, and set it on the edge of his desk for delivery in the morning. He had no way of knowing that Commander Holloway had already received a phone call that afternoon from Captain Saunders. He had no way of knowing that Saunders had mentioned a logistics specialist who found a 3-week supply chain failure in 45 minutes. He had no way of knowing that Holloway, upon hearing the name Morgan, had gone very still on the phone and said quietly, "Is she the one who came through the east entrance this morning?" And Saunders had said, "Yes, sir." "You know her?" And Holloway had said nothing for 3 seconds that felt longer than 3 seconds, and then said, "Bring me the sealed packet from her transfer orders, the secondary envelope." Knox set his alarm for 05:45 and went to sleep. Down the hall, the light in the logistics building was still on. Claire Morgan was at a workstation on the 2nd floor, and her green notebook was open on the desk beside her keyboard, and she was writing in it while a base-wide logistics report loaded on her screen. Not reviewing it. Studying it. The way you studied something you were planning to fix. Commander James Holloway had been at Redstone Valley for 18 months, and in that time he had learned to calibrate his concern for things on a spectrum. Most things fell in the lower range. Administrative friction, personnel conflicts, equipment delays, the ordinary entropy of a large operating base. He managed those with the methodical competence of someone who had been doing this for a long time. The sealed envelope on his desk was not in the lower range. He'd opened it the previous evening after Saunders's call. He'd read the contents twice, and then he'd made a phone call to a number that was not in the base directory. And the person who answered confirmed what he'd read, and he'd thanked them and hung up and sat for a while in the kind of silence that followed. Information you had to recalibrate around. Now it was 0600 and Knox's complaint had been hand-delivered by a runner at 0545. Holloway held it in both hands and read it carefully. He put it down. He looked at the sealed envelope. He thought about what it meant that Tyler Knox, Sergeant First Class, 11 years in, 3 commendations, known throughout the base for a particular talent with intimidation, had filed this complaint against this specific person without doing any background research first. Holloway had been in the military long enough to know that every institutional system contained people who mistook their position for protection, who believed that the machinery of rank and hierarchy would absorb whatever they put into it. Knox had filed this complaint in the full confidence that it would do what complaints had always done for him: move the problem somewhere else and reframe the story. Holloway looked at the sealed envelope again. The problem with that calculation, he thought, was that it required you to correctly identify who had power and who didn't. Knox had identified wrong. Holloway picked up his phone. "Get me the schedule for the weekly assembly," he said, "and find out what section Specialist Morgan is working in today." He listened. "No," he said. "Don't tell her anything. I want her there. Just make sure she's there." He hung up. Outside his window, the base was coming awake. Lights in the vehicle depot, soldiers moving toward the mess hall, the sound of a helicopter passing somewhere to the northeast, its rotors chopping the cold morning air into pieces. Holloway picked up Knox's complaint and read it one more time. Then he placed it in a file folder and wrote a single word on the tab. He didn't write complaint, he didn't write incident report. He wrote Knox T, and beneath it, in smaller letters, pending. He set the folder in his tray, and in the mess hall on the other side of the base, Claire Morgan was already sitting at the corner table with her back to the wall, her green notebook open, her coffee cooling beside her hand. She was writing, and she was watching. And she had been watching since the moment she walked through that east entrance, not with the vigilance of someone who felt threatened, but with the patience of someone who already knew what she was going to find, and was simply waiting for the evidence to arrange itself into the shape she expected. Tyler Knox walked through the north entrance at 0623. He saw her at the corner table. His jaw tightened. He looked away first. Knox looked away first, and Claire registered that, the small, involuntary retreat of his eyes, and wrote 3 words in her notebook without looking down. Then she turned the page and kept working. The complaint moved through the base the way paper always moved through a military installation, slowly in terms of official process and instantly in terms of rumor. By 0800, the document Knox had sealed and delivered to the command office at first light had already produced a shadow version of itself. A verbal copy, imprecise and growing, traveling through the barracks and the vehicle depot and the administrative wing in fragments and approximations. What people said they'd heard was that Knox had filed assault charges. What other people said was that the charges were for insubordination. A third version said both. A fourth version, circulating specifically in the North Barracks, where Knox had the most social infrastructure, said the logistics transfer had a history of instability and had been moved from her previous assignment under circumstances that weren't discussed in polite company. That version had no basis in anything, but it had the advantage of being vague enough to resist contradiction, and it traveled fast. Corporal Marcus Webb was its primary carrier. He moved through the base that morning with the specific energy of someone who'd been given a job he believed in. He wasn't stupid. Webb understood on some level that he was functioning as a distribution network for Knox's preferred narrative, but he was the kind of person who resolved the discomfort of that understanding by committing fully to the role. If he believed hard enough, it became true. That was the logic. He found Specialist Anita Collier in the break room adjacent to the admin processing wing at 0820 and started the conversation the way he started most conversations. Sideways, with something casual. "You processed the transfer that came in yesterday? Through the East Wing?" Collier was pouring coffee and did not turn around. I process a lot of transfers. Female, logistics, no unit patch. A half-second pause. What about her? Just wondering what her paperwork said. Background. Previous assignments. Collier turned around. She had her coffee mug in both hands, and her expression was the particular kind of neutral that people wore when they were deciding how much to give away. You know I can't discuss intake documentation, Marcus. I'm not asking for classified stuff, just general picture, where she came from, what her record looks like. Why? Webb shifted slightly. Sergeant Knox filed a complaint this morning. Command's going to want what command decides it wants, Collier said. It's not going to come through you, and it's not going to come through whatever Knox told you to do this morning. Webb's face went still. Nobody told me to do anything. Good. Collier picked up her coffee. Then you don't have to worry about it. She walked back to her workstation and sat down and opened her screen, and Webb stood in the break room doorway for 3 seconds with nowhere to go, and then he left. Collier set her mug on the desk and stared at her monitor without seeing it. She was thinking about the secondary envelope, the classification stamp she recognized, and the distribution code she had never seen. The way Claire Morgan had sat across from her and handed over documents with the practiced calm of someone who had done this before. Not nervousness, not performance, just efficiency. And the officer quarters request. Collier had put through the officer quarters request without escalating it for review. She'd made the judgment call silently, alone, based on the sealed envelope and a sixth sense she didn't have a name for. Now she was wondering if her sixth sense had been right. She pulled up the base housing records and confirmed that Claire Morgan had been assigned to a room in the officer quarters block, Building 7, East Side, and that the assignment had gone through without a flag. She stared at it for a moment. Then she closed the window and started her actual work and tried not to think about it anymore, and failed. The Supply Chain Coordination Office ran better that morning than it had in 3 weeks. That wasn't something Captain Saunders announced or acknowledged directly, because he wasn't entirely sure how to do that without also acknowledging why, and acknowledging why meant acknowledging that the problem had existed for 3 weeks without his team finding it, which was a conversation he wasn't ready to have at 0900 on a Thursday. But the tracking monitor on the east wall showed the held emergency ration shipments moving through the distribution hub with the first of the retroactive authorizations processed and cleared. Lieutenant Yates was on a call with the hub coordinator, walking through the remaining backlog. Staff Sergeant Diaz had the full inventory of affected shipments open on his screen and was working backward through the authorization chain, methodically. Claire Morgan was at the end-of-row workstation, working through a separate file. Nobody had assigned her to it. The file? Base-wide logistical contingency planning, last updated 11 months prior, was not on anyone's current task list. It was technically in the queue for quarterly review, but had not been touched since the previous review cycle because nobody had gotten to it. She'd found it in the shared system and opened it without mentioning it to anyone, and she was reading it the way she read everything, carefully page by page, making notes in the green notebook beside the keyboard rather than in the system, which Saunders noticed and thought was a strange choice until he realized that writing in the notebook instead of the system meant her notes didn't go into the official record. She was keeping 2 parallel tracks. He observed this from his office doorway for approximately 45 seconds before Yates called his name from across the room and pulled him into a question about the hub authorization format. By 1,000 hours, the Northeast Depot was back on schedule for its first delivery in 22 days. Nobody threw a party. Diaz made a quiet sound of satisfaction and updated the tracking record. Yates finished her call and crossed something off a list. The tracking monitor changed. Saunders looked at Claire from across the room. She was still reading the contingency plan. He went back into his office and closed the door partway, and thought about the phone call he'd made to Holloway the previous day, and about what Holloway had said, and had very deliberately not said, in response. At 11:45, Webb came into the coordination office. He didn't announce himself. He appeared in the doorway the way people appeared in doorways when they wanted their arrival to be seen as casual, but had specifically chosen a moment when the room was not empty. He scanned the workstations and found Claire at the end of the second row and pulled his chin slightly to one side in the way that meant he was filing information away. Lieutenant Yates looked up. "Can I help you?" "Looking for Sergeant Diaz." "He's in the back pulling physical records." "I'll wait." He didn't wait. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and let his attention drift, which was transparently not what he was doing, and after 15 seconds, Claire looked up from her screen and looked at him directly. He met her eyes for a beat. Then he looked at the tracking monitor on the east wall and pretended to read it. The numbers on the monitor were logistics data. Webb had no logistics training. He had no reason to be reading it. He just needed somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't her face. She went back to her screen. Diaz came back from the records room carrying a stack of folders and stopped when he saw Webb. "Marcus, what's up?" "Sergeant Knox wanted to know if you're still on for the PT session at 1400. "Yeah, I'll be there." Webb nodded. His eyes went back to Claire's workstation, not directly at an angle, the way someone tracked a peripheral concern, and then he said, "All right," and left. Diaz watched the empty doorway for a second. Then he looked at Claire. She was reading. Diaz set his folders down and went back to his workstation and said nothing. But he'd been in the military long enough to know what surveillance dressed as errands looked like, and what he'd just watched was surveillance dressed as an errand. He thought about the supply chain fix from yesterday. He thought about Webb. He thought about Knox's complaint, which he'd heard about through the standard barracks communications network by 0730. Then he opened his first folder and got back to work, and said nothing, and stored the thought somewhere he could find it later. The PT session at 1400 was in the North Fitness block, and it wasn't really a PT session. Knox ran it the way he ran most things, with a surface-level legitimate purpose wrapped around an actual agenda. There were 7 soldiers present: Webb, Stills, the junior corporal who'd signed the complaint that morning, and 4 others from the North Barracks who existed in Knox's orbit at varying degrees of proximity. They did circuits for the first 20 minutes with the focused intensity of people who'd been told this was about fitness. Then Knox called a rest and they stood around the water station and the actual purpose surfaced. "She's in the logistics coordination office," Webb said, "working with Yates's team." "Doing what?" "Reading files. Supply chain stuff." Supply chain. Knox absorbed this. Not her assignment. Saunders apparently let her sit in. Collier put her in officer housing. That landed in the room differently than the supply chain information. Stills straightened slightly. The junior corporal, his name was Fields, PFC Darnell Fields, who had signed the complaint because he trusted Webb's summary of events and hadn't questioned it, looked between Knox and Webb. "Officer housing?" Fields said, "on a logistics transfer." "Collier made a call," Webb said. "Didn't escalate." Knox was quiet for a moment. He turned the water bottle in his hands. "So Holloway hasn't reviewed her placement yet." "I don't know what Holloway's reviewed. Holloway's office would have flagged housing misassignment by now if it was irregular." Knox set the water bottle down. "Meaning Collier had authorization she didn't explain." More quiet. "So where's the authorization come from?" Stills asked. "That's what I'd like to know." Fields shifted his weight. He was beginning to feel the first edges of a discomfort he hadn't had when he signed the complaint, a faint sense that he'd entered a situation without fully seeing it. "Sergeant," he said, "if there's documentation in her transfer orders that—" "There's nothing in her transfer orders," Knox said. "Webb says the processing file shows a standard logistics reassignment." "There was a secondary envelope," Webb said. "Collier separated it." Knox looked at him. "Secondary envelope. Sealed. Went to Holloway directly." The room absorbed that. Knox picked up his water bottle again. He turned it twice. "Okay," he said, in a way that meant he was rearranging pieces. Fields looked at his shoes. He was thinking about the complaint he'd signed. He hadn't seen the incident in the dining hall. He'd signed based on Webb's account, and Webb's account had been simple and confident, and Fields had been on base for only 6 months, and Knox's sphere was the easiest gravity to live inside. But a secondary envelope that went to Holloway directly was not a logistics specialist's paperwork. Fields knew enough to know that. "I need to know who this woman is before the complaint goes to review," Knox said. Complaint's already been received, Webb said. I know. I need to know before the response comes. How do you find out if the documentation is sealed? Knox looked at the water bottle in his hands. You find someone who already knows, and you ask the right questions. Fields didn't ask who that was. He had a feeling Knox already had a candidate. He had a feeling the afternoon was going to move in a direction he hadn't signed up for, and he was beginning to understand that signing the complaint had committed him to a trajectory he didn't fully control. He bent down to retie a bootlace that didn't need retying, and while he was down there, he thought about the way Webb had described the dining hall incident and compared it to the 3 other versions he'd heard since this morning, and he noticed that Knox's version was the only one where the woman had moved first. He stood back up and didn't say anything, and counted the minutes until the session ended. Well, Claire ate lunch alone. The mess hall was at half capacity at midday. The lunch rush distributed across multiple sittings due to scheduling, and she took the same corner table with the same back-to-wall orientation and ordered whatever was at the front of the serving line because she wasn't there for the food. She was there to watch. 3 days on a base told you more about its institutional culture than 3 months of official briefings. You watched who deferred to whom, you watched who laughed when a superior walked in and who kept eating. You watched table formation, who sat with whom, and who got up when certain people arrived. You watched the servers, the cleaning staff, the soldiers who came in already arguing, and the ones who came in already tired. Claire had done versions of this on 4 different bases. It wasn't a technique she'd invented. It was something she'd learned from a warrant officer named Desmond Farr, who'd spent 2 decades evaluating unit cohesion from the inside before anyone knew he was evaluating it. Farr had told her once that the dining hall was the most honest place on any installation, because it was the only place where everyone was equal in at least one way. They all had to eat. She wrote in her notebook while she watched. She'd accumulated 6 pages in the 2 days since she'd arrived. Observations, patterns, names associated with patterns. The way certain junior soldiers navigated around Knox's table even when Knox wasn't present. The physical avoidance behavior had already shaped itself into the architecture of the room, independent of the man it centered on. The way Lieutenant Yates ate lunch with her headphones in and her eyes on her phone, which was the posture of a competent person who had stopped expecting the lunch hour to be professionally useful. The way Captain Saunders always sat with 2 other captains from adjacent departments, never with his own team, which was a management habit with a specific implication she'd noted with a small asterisk. She was on page 7 when Danny Reyes appeared at the edge of her table. He stood there with his tray, not sitting, with the posture of someone who hadn't decided yet. She looked up. "You can sit," she said. He sat, with the specific care of someone choosing a position across from a live wire. He arranged his food in front of him and picked up his fork and then put it down again. "People are talking about you," he said. "I know. Worse than yesterday. Knox told Webb to talk to people." "I know that too." Danny looked at his food. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question, not as a social performance. She actually seemed to be running it honestly, checking against something internal. "Some of it," she said. "Not the way he probably wants it to." "What part?" She looked at the room. "The ones who signed statements without being there. That one bothers me. Not because of what it means for me, because of what it means for them." Danny followed her gaze. Across the room, PFC Fields was eating with Stills and another soldier from the North Barracks. Fields was looking at his tray and not talking much. "Fields signed," Danny said. "I heard this morning." "How old is he?" 20? Maybe 21. "How long on base?" 5, 6 months? Claire wrote something in her notebook. "First installation?" "I think so." She nodded once, a small economical motion. Then she picked up her coffee and drank and looked at the wall above the east windows. Danny ate in silence for a minute. He was aware that this was probably the strangest lunch he'd had since joining the military, and that he couldn't fully account for why he kept seeking out proximity to this woman who gave him very little and somehow made him want to give her things in return. Information, context, whatever would be useful. "You found the supply chain thing yesterday," he said. "Diaz told you." "Gallo told me." "Diaz told Gallo." He paused. "Apparently it's all everybody's talking about in the logistics building." That'll fade, she said. Why do you say that? Because the people it embarrasses will redirect the conversation. Danny thought about Saunders' two unanswered inquiries up the chain. Saunders? He's not a bad officer, she said. He's a careful one. There's a difference. Careful officers manage their exposure. He'll find a way to reframe it. Reframe it how? As a team discovery, process improvement, something that doesn't require identifying where the failure started. She set down her coffee. It's fine. The shipments are moving. That was the point. Danny was quiet for a moment. You don't care that he might take credit for it? No? Why not? She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. Her expression wasn't warm, wasn't cold, was simply very present, the look of someone allocating full attention. Because credit isn't what I'm here for, she said. And she went back to her notebook, and Danny Reyes ate the rest of his lunch feeling like he'd been handed a piece of something he didn't fully know what to do with yet. At 15:20, Knox went to the administrative processing wing. He didn't go to Collier's station. He went to the section that handled personnel records access, a smaller office adjacent to the main wing, staffed by a single records clerk named Specialist Ryan Okafor, who was 25 years old and had been at Redstone Valley for 3 years, and who had, in that time, developed a very specific immunity to requests that came from senior NCOs who wanted things they weren't supposed to have. Knox sat in the chair across from Okafor's desk and put on the version of himself that he deployed for this kind of situation. Not the dining hall Knox, not the PT session Knox, but the collegial Knox, the Knox who had seen everything and understood how the system actually worked and wanted to help you navigate it. Transfer that came through the East Wing 2 days ago, Knox said. Logistics specialist, Morgan, I need to see the full intake file. Okafor looked at him. I can show you the visible documentation, the process transfer orders. I need the full file, including any secondary documentation. Secondary documentation in a classified intake isn't accessible through this office, Sergeant. You know that. I'm not asking about classified content. I'm asking about the full personnel file. Pre-existing record, previous assignments, any performance flags. Okafor's expression didn't change in any way that was visible from the outside. Internally, he was making a quick calculation that he'd made before in analogous situations. I'd need a request form, he said, signed by an officer. Personnel record access without command authorization requires a DA 1559 for NCO level requests. Knox leaned forward slightly. This is related to an active complaint I filed this morning. Command Office. Against this individual. Then Command Office will authorize the records pull as part of the review process. Okafor said. Standard procedure. You don't need to go around it. I'm not going around anything. I'm trying to support my own complaint with complete information. I understand that, Sergeant. The process for that is still a DA 1559 with officer authorization. Okafor pulled a form from his desk drawer and placed it on the desk between them. I can walk you through the form right now if that helps. Knox looked at the form. He looked at Okafor. Okafor's face gave him nothing. Knox picked up the form. He studied it for 3 seconds longer than necessary, which was the Knox version of retreating without showing that he was retreating. I'll get the authorization, he said. Great. Okafor folded his hands on his desk. Takes 48 hours minimum for officer review. Knox stood. 48 hours. Minimum. Knox left, and Okafor watched the door close, and then he turned to his screen and found the transfer file for Claire Morgan and looked at the visible section, the part he could access without specialized clearance, and he noted the distribution code on the secondary envelope stamp, which was visible in the filing record even if the envelope's contents weren't. He'd seen that distribution code once before, 18 months ago, on a file that had come through this office for a 2-week temporary assignment. The man whose file it was had walked around base in plain uniform for 9 days, running what appeared to be a facilities assessment before the nature of the assessment was clarified to the base commander, who had then had a very different conversation with his staff about the previous 9 days than he'd expected to have. Okafor noted the date and time in his personal log. Not the official log, his personal one. and closed the screen. Down the hall, the records clerk who occupied the adjacent office knocked on the wall between them. "You good?" "Fine," Okafor said. "Just thinking." "About what?" He looked at the closed door where Knox had left. "About how people don't check what's in front of them before they start pulling on things," he said. The knock that came at 1700 on Commander Holloway's office door was not from Knox, not from Saunders, not from any of the people Holloway had been managing the ripples of since the previous afternoon. It was from his executive officer, Major Diana Chen, who came in with a tablet and the expression she wore when something had moved faster than the timeline they'd been operating on. She closed the door behind her. "Knox tried to pull the personnel file from records," she said. "Okafor blocked it. Standard form redirect." Holloway leaned back. "He'll try again through a different channel." "Probably." Chen set the tablet on his desk. On it was a summary of the last 24 hours, the supply chain finding, the officer housing assignment, the complaint, Webb's movement through the base that morning, the PT session with Fields and the others, the records access attempt. Holloway looked at it without touching it. "The assembly's tomorrow," he said. "Yes, sir." "She know?" "Not unless someone told her informally." "Nobody told her." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't need to know." Chen looked at him. It was the look of someone who had worked for this man long enough to read the texture of his pauses. "You've worked with her before." "Once, overseas, different context." He picked up the tablet and looked at the summary again. "She doesn't work the way you'd expect her to. You expect her to be protecting herself, moving pieces. She's not. She's just observing." "Observing what?" "Whatever she came to observe." He set the tablet down. "Which is the point." Chen was quiet. "The complaint goes to review at 0900 tomorrow," Holloway said. "Before the assembly. I want the security footage from the dining hall pulled and reviewed tonight. I want witness statements from anyone present who has not been in contact with Knox or Webb in the last 48 hours. Independent contact. That'll take until midnight. Then it takes until midnight." Chen picked up her tablet. At the door, she paused. "What happens if Knox escalates before the assembly? Goes to a superior contact? He has connections in battalion." "He has connections in battalion," Holloway agreed, "and those connections are going to run into the secondary envelope and stop." He looked at the window. "He doesn't know what he's filed against. That's the problem with filing first and checking later." After she left, the office was quiet except for the bass sounds filtering through the glass. The distant engine of a vehicle in the depot, the PA system running a weather advisory for the following morning, the steady white noise of a large installation breathing. Holloway pulled the secondary envelope from his desk drawer and set it in front of him. He didn't open it. He'd already read it twice. But he set it on the desk the way you set things on a desk when you wanted to look at what they represented. He thought about Claire Morgan at the corner table with her green notebook, writing while she watched. He thought about Knox's complaint. He thought about what was going to happen in the dining hall during tomorrow's assembly, when the base saw what Knox had actually done, who he'd chosen of all the people available to him, and what that choice said about the limits of a particular kind of confidence. Holloway had spent his career watching the gap between what people thought they knew and what they actually knew, and in that gap he'd seen careers end, operations fail, units fracture. Knox had looked at a quiet woman in a worn uniform at a corner table and seen something beneath him. He'd filed a complaint against the negative space. He had no idea what was standing in it. Holloway set the secondary envelope back in the drawer and locked it. Outside his window, the base lights were coming on in sequence as the evening thickened. The vehicle depot first, then the barracks perimeter, then the long amber line of the main corridor that connected the command building to the dining facility. He watched them come on the way. He watched things that were about to change without knowing yet that they were about to change. He picked up his phone and called Chen. 0900 review, he said, and make sure the assembly setup is ready by 10:30. Already on it, she said. He hung up and sat in the quiet for another minute, and then he went home to his quarters, and the base settled into its night rhythms, and somewhere in Building 7, east side, the light in room 14 stayed on until past 2200. The assembly was a weekly event at Redstone Valley. mandatory attendance for all non-deployed personnel above a certain grade, held in the main dining facility because it was the only space on the installation large enough to hold the relevant population without staging people in hallways. The tables were pushed to the walls. Chairs were arranged in rows facing a raised platform at the north end. It took the kitchen staff 45 minutes to reconfigure the space and another 15 to set it back afterward. And they did it every week with the weary professionalism of people who had converted the same room too many times to find it remarkable. By 10:20, the chairs were filling. Knox came in with Webb and Stills at 10:22, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who owned the room. He found his row, senior NCOs, center left, and settled in with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had done what needed doing and was waiting for the system to confirm it. He'd heard from Webb that the complaint review had been moved to 0900. He'd heard nothing from the command office about outcomes, which he interpreted as the complaint being processed. In Knox's experience, silence from command meant paperwork in motion. Paperwork in motion meant the logistics transfer would be receiving something official before the end of the week, a counseling statement at minimum, a flag on her record, possibly a reassignment back through the East Wing and out of Redstone Valley entirely. He looked around the room. He didn't see her. That was fine. Assembly attendance was based on rank, and if her paperwork showed her as a logistics specialist pending reassignment, she might not be on the mandatory list. He hadn't checked. He hadn't needed to. PFC Fields came in 2 minutes later and found a seat 3 rows behind Knox. He sat with his back straight and his hands on his knees and looked at the platform at the north end of the room. He'd slept badly. He'd spent most of the night running through the complaint he'd signed and the version of events he'd signed it based on and the growing dissonance between those two things. And somewhere around 200, he'd decided that if there was an opportunity to recant the statement, he was going to take it. He just didn't know how yet. Danny Reyes was in the back row. He'd arrived early, not because he was eager, but because he liked the back row, and the back row filled last. He had a clear line of sight to the platform and to most of the room, and when people filed in, he watched them the way he'd started watching things differently since Monday morning, with a slightly more deliberate attention to what people's bodies said before their mouths opened. At 10:28, the side door near the kitchen corridor opened and Claire Morgan came in. She was still in the plain service uniform, still no visible rank beyond the name tag. She moved along the east wall toward the back section and found a seat in the second-to-last row, 4 seats from Danny Reyes, and sat with the same orientation she always had. Back to the wall, eyes to the room. Knox didn't see her come in. He was talking to the senior NCO to his left. Webb saw her. He turned forward immediately and said nothing. Major Chen entered at 10:30 from the north entrance, followed by 2 officers Danny didn't recognize, followed by Commander Holloway, who walked the length of the room toward the platform with the particular stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going and wasn't concerned about how long it was taking to get there. The room stood. Holloway stepped up to the platform and looked at them for a moment. "Seats," he said. They sat. Jimtem. The first 15 minutes of the assembly were routine, operational updates, maintenance schedule for 2 vehicle classes, a reminder about the upcoming base inspection and the documentation it required. Holloway delivered it the way he delivered most things, directly, without performance, with the efficiency of someone who respected the time of the people in front of him. Knox half listened. He was watching the clock. Then Holloway set down the papers he'd been referencing and looked at the room without them, which was a shift in register that people noticed. "Before we close," he said, "I want to address something that happened in this facility on Monday morning." Knox's posture changed by approximately 2 degrees, not enough to be visible, enough to be felt by Webb, who was sitting next to him and who went still in the specific way of someone bracing for impact. An incident occurred between a member of this installation's permanent party and a soldier processing through on temporary assignment, Holloway said. A formal complaint was filed. I reviewed that complaint this morning, along with the supporting documentation, and I want to address it here because I believe the people in this room deserve to understand what actually happened, rather than the version that's been circulating for the last 48 hours. The room was very quiet. Holloway looked at the folder in his hand. The dining facility footage was reviewed last night by myself and my executive officer. We also received independent statements from 7 personnel who were present at the time of the incident and had no subsequent contact with the complainant or his associates. Knox was looking at the platform with an expression that had stopped moving. The footage and independent testimony are consistent with each other and inconsistent with the formal complaint as written, Holloway said. The formal complaint describes unprovoked physical contact initiated by the soldier on temporary assignment. The footage and testimony describe a different sequence of events. Specifically, the confrontation was initiated by the complainant. The physical contact occurred after a tray was displaced, not accidentally, and after the complainant physically blocked the temporary assignment soldier's path. Fields, 3 rows back, exhaled through his nose, slowly. "I'm not going to adjudicate the full matter from this platform," Holloway said. "That process will continue through appropriate channels. What I'm going to do is address something that I think is more important to this installation than the specific incident." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of someone deciding exactly how much to say and in what order. "We have a culture problem," he said. "Not everywhere on this base, but in enough places that it showed up in this room, at breakfast, in front of 300 people without anyone stopping it." He looked at the room, not at Knox specifically, but at the whole room, which was in some ways more uncomfortable for Knox than being looked at directly. "We have people on this installation who confuse intimidation with leadership, who identify targets based on apparent vulnerability, who build credibility by making others smaller." A pause. "That is not leadership. I don't care how many years in you have. I don't care what your record looks like. If your authority requires an audience and a victim, it's not authority, it's a performance." Silence. "The soldier who was targeted on Monday," Holloway said, "was not who Sergeant Knox believed she was." And then he turned. He stepped down from the platform. He walked the center aisle between the rows of chairs, and people turned to watch him pass, and the direction he was walking became clear about 3 seconds before he arrived, and by the time he stopped, the entire room was following his trajectory. He stopped in front of Claire Morgan, and he saluted. A full, deliberate, formal salute, the kind that moved up the chain, not down it. The room did not make a sound. Claire stood. She was calm. Her hands were at her sides. There was no performance in it, no satisfaction, no vindication on her face, just the contained, level attention of someone completing a protocol they'd completed many times. She returned the salute. "Colonel Claire Morgan," Holloway said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room without him raising it. "Welcome back." The words landed in the mess hall and stayed there, hanging in the recycled air above 300 people who had spent 2 days building a story about a woman who didn't belong and now had to take that story apart and replace it with the one that was actually true. Colonel. Not logistics specialist, not transfer processing, not the quiet woman who had dropped her tray and been laughed at. Colonel. Danny Reyes felt the word go through him like a physical thing. He thought of the 4 seconds in the dining hall. He thought of the supply chain fix. He thought of the green notebook and the back-to-wall seating and the way she'd said, "I'm not worried about it," with the flatness of someone who had done a calculation with completely different inputs than the ones Knox was using. He thought about what Gallo had said in the vehicle depot. You know what that usually means. He did know. He'd known, and he'd half known, and he'd not let himself finish the thought. And now it was finished, and it was this. Colonel Claire Morgan, whose name and record were sealed behind a distribution code that Specialist Okafor recognized from a previous situation, and Specialist Collier had processed without asking questions because the sixth sense she'd developed over 4 years told her not to. Knox had filed a formal complaint against a colonel who had designed emergency response systems, who had commanded in operational environments that required decisions in seconds, and the kind of physical training that turned 4 seconds into a controlled, precise outcome rather than a brawl, who had come to this base without rank on her collar because she was here to see what the base looked like when it thought no one important was watching. Knox was still sitting in his chair in the center left row. He had not moved since Holloway said Colonel. His face had done a series of things in the last 30 seconds that his face did not normally do in public. A rapid, involuntary sequence of recalibration that Webb, seated beside him, watched from the corner of his eye with the focused dread of someone watching a structure fail. Fields, 3 rows back, was looking at his hands. Holloway walked back to the platform. He didn't look at Knox. He didn't need to. "Dismissed," he said. The room took a moment to remember how to move. Then it began to, not with the usual noise and momentum of an assembly ending, but carefully, people rising and repositioning with the self-conscious awareness of an audience exiting a theater where something unscripted had just occurred. Nobody rushed. Nobody talked loudly. Eyes went to Claire Morgan, and then away, and then back. The involuntary magnetic pull of a situation that had just reorganized itself around a point that wasn't where anyone had been looking. Knox stood. He was careful about it. He stood with deliberate steadiness, the physical performance of someone who was not going to let his body show what his face had already shown. He tucked in his chair. He nodded to the wall, not to anyone specifically, and moved toward the north exit. Webb fell in behind him and said nothing. Stills fell in behind Webb. At the north exit, Knox paused. Just briefly, a fraction of a second, the pause of someone whose body wanted to look back but whose pride had just barely won. He went through the door. The north exit swung shut. Major Chen was at Claire's side within 30 seconds of the room beginning to clear, and their conversation was quiet and brief and professional, and Chen handed her a folder that Claire took without opening and tucked under her arm. They walked toward the north side of the room together, and people moved out of the corridor they formed without being asked, the way people moved when authority was no longer theoretical. Danny Reyes didn't move for a while. He sat in the back row as the chairs around him emptied, and he held what he'd just watched, and he thought about Monday morning. The tray on the floor, the laughter moving west, the 4 seconds, the green notebook. And he thought about how the same woman had been in this room twice, and the room had been completely different both times, and she had been exactly the same. That was the part that stayed with him. She had been exactly the same. The command office debriefing happened at 11:30, in a room that was not the main conference room but the smaller one adjacent to it, the one used for conversations that didn't need an audience. Holloway, Chen, and Claire. A recorder running, a transcript that would be filed with the appropriate oversight body and not circulated on base. Holloway had reviewed the contingency plan she'd been working through in the coordination office. He had 3 questions written on a legal pad in front of him. He asked them in order. "What were your primary observations?" Claire opened her green notebook on the table. She had the pages flagged with small paper clips. She went through it methodically. The table formation patterns in the dining hall, the management behavior she'd identified in Saunders, the junior personnel dynamics in the North Barracks, the supply chain failure, and what it indicated about documentation communication protocols, 2 other logistical gaps she'd identified in the contingency plan that had gone unreviewed for 11 months. She spoke for 9 minutes without stopping except when Holloway asked a clarifying question. Chen took notes. "The NCO issue," Holloway said. "Knox." "That's a symptom," Claire said, "not the diagnosis." "Explain." "He operated the way he operated because the environment allowed it. People signed statements without direct knowledge. A junior soldier with 6 months on base signed a formal complaint against someone he'd never seen because the social gravity of the group made refusal feel more dangerous than compliance." She looked at the notebook. "That's not Knox's individual failure. That's an institutional permission structure." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "What do you recommend?" "The permission structure changes when the cost of compliance with it becomes higher than the cost of refusal. You raised the cost today. The assembly mattered." She paused. "The follow-up matters more." "The formal review." "Yes. And how you handle the soldiers who signed based on social pressure rather than direct knowledge. If they're treated the same as Knox, you lose the lesson. If they're treated differently in a way that requires them to account for their own reasoning, that's the lesson." Chen looked up from her notes. "Specifically," Claire said, "the private who signed without being present and who has clearly been rethinking it since this morning. He needs a different conversation than Knox gets." "Fields," Chen said. "Yes." Holloway looked at her. You identified him this morning? I identified him Monday, in the dining hall. He wasn't there, but he was uncomfortable about not being there when it came up in subsequent conversation. That kind of discomfort either resolves toward honesty or toward deeper entrenchment. It went toward honesty. She closed the notebook. He's worth keeping, if you handle this right. Holloway wrote something on his legal pad. Your official assignment designation goes into effect at 1800 today. Logistics infrastructure assessment and contingency planning review, 6 weeks. That works. You'll be working out of the coordination office. I'd prefer the secondary office on the east side of the logistics building. Less traffic. Done. Claire looked at the table for a moment. She looked like she was going to say something and then reconsidering it. Say it, Holloway said. She looked at him. Something passed across her face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite acknowledgement. Something human and briefly unguarded. You used my line, she said. He almost smiled. I know. The knock on Knox's door came at 1400. Not Chen, not Holloway. A runner, young, impersonal, holding an envelope. Knox took it and closed the door and sat on the edge of his bed and opened it. It was a formal notification. Administrative hold pending review. His access to personnel records, base communication channels beyond essential functions, and supervisory authority over junior personnel was suspended effective 1200 today. Pending the outcome of the investigation into the dining hall incident and the accuracy of the formal complaint. He read it twice. He set it on the desk beside the original complaint document, which was still there, which he hadn't moved because he'd been waiting for the system to do what the system had always done. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at both documents. In 11 years, he'd filed 4 complaints. All 4 had landed the way he'd aimed them. He'd understood. He'd believed, with the deep certainty of a man who'd tested a theory and found it consistent, that the military's institutional machinery responded to documentation the way a machine responded to input. You put the right paper in, you got the right result out. The content of the truth mattered less than the confidence of the claim. He'd watched it work. He'd built a career on the edges of it. He hadn't checked. He'd looked at a woman in a worn uniform eating alone at a corner table, and he hadn't checked, because in 11 years of operating this way, checking had never been necessary. He picked up the administrative hold notification and looked at the signature line. Commander James Holloway. Below that, as a matter of formal record, the secondary authorizing signatory, Colonel Claire Morgan. Knox looked at her name for a long time. He set the paper down. He sat in his room in the early afternoon light with 11 years of certainty rearranging itself around a gap, the specific structural gap between what he'd been sure he knew and what he'd refused to verify. And the room was very quiet, and there was nothing in it that could close that gap for him. Outside the North Barracks, the base was running on its ordinary afternoon rhythm. Vehicles in the depot, personnel moving between buildings, the PA running a maintenance schedule update. On the other side of the installation, in the secondary office on the east side of the logistics building, Claire Morgan was at a desk with the 11-month-old contingency plan open in front of her and her green notebook beside it, and she was working. The green notebook was on page 11. She was writing steadily, precisely, without pause, the way she did everything, not because it was easy, but because she had long ago made peace with the distance between what a place was and what it needed to become, and she knew how to work in that distance without needing anyone to acknowledge she was there. Her coffee was cold. She hadn't touched it in an hour. The base hummed around her, and in Building 7, East Side, Room 14, the light would come on again after dark, and she would sit with her back to the wall and her eyes to the room, and she would keep working, because the work was the point. It had always been the point. The contingency plan had 43 pages and 11 months of accumulated neglect, and by the third evening Claire was working through it. She'd filled 14 pages of the green notebook with observations, cross-references, and questions that the plan raised but didn't answer. The secondary office on the east side of the logistics building was small enough that the desk took up a third of it. One window faced the vehicle depot. The overhead light had a flicker at irregular intervals that she'd stopped noticing by the second day. There was a second chair that nobody used and a filing cabinet that contained documents from 2019 that were technically still active and practically irrelevant. She didn't mind the space. She'd worked in worse. What she minded on the third evening was the knock at the door at 1840. Not because she didn't expect it eventually. She'd expected it since the assembly. But because she'd been in the middle of a section on forward supply positioning that had 3 compounding errors in its base assumptions, and interruptions in the middle of compounding errors meant starting over from the beginning of the logic chain when you came back. "Come in," she said. Captain Roy Saunders opened the door and stood in the frame with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this and was already deviating from the script. He was in his off-duty uniform. He'd come after hours deliberately, which told her something. "Sir," he said, then stopped. That's... He made a small, involuntary gesture with his right hand. "I wasn't sure of the protocol. In terms of address, given..." "Captain Saunders," she said. "Sit down." He sat in the second chair. He had his hands on his knees, and he looked like a man carrying something he'd been carrying for 3 days and was finally near enough to a surface to set it down. "The supply chain thing," he said. "Yes. I put through 2 inquiry requests, up the chain." "I know. I read them." He looked at her. "They weren't wrong. The inquiries were correct procedure." They were. The problem wasn't the inquiry process. The problem was the documentation gap predated your request by about 6 weeks, and the people responding to the inquiries were looking at the same visible layer of the system that you were looking at. Nobody looked at the receiving log secondary column because the update that created the requirement for it wasn't distributed to base level. "I should have found that." "Maybe," she said, "but you would have needed to know the update existed to look for its downstream effects. Did you receive notification of the coordination update from the 14th? He paused. "No, I don't think so." "You didn't. I checked the distribution record. The update went to hub administrators and depot managers, not to base coordination teams. That's the actual failure point." She looked at him steadily. "You ran the right process against incomplete information. The gap wasn't your process." He was quiet for a moment. "My team found it embarrassing that you walked in and found it in 45 minutes. I know. Yates especially. She's competent. She doesn't handle..." He paused. "She doesn't like looking like she missed something." "She didn't miss it. She didn't have the information that would have let her find it." Claire looked at her notebook. "I'd suggest telling her that specifically. She needs to hear it from you." "Is that a recommendation or a directive?" "It's an observation," Claire said. "What you do with it is yours." He exhaled. He rubbed the back of his neck. He was not a man who was comfortable with this kind of conversation, the kind that sat right at the edge of professional and human without being fully either. But he was also not a man who had avoided it, which she noted. "The assembly," he said. "Yes. I didn't know. About your rank, your assignment." He looked at her. "I want to be clear. I didn't know when I called Holloway. I called because the supply chain thing was significant, and I thought he should know about it, not because I knew who you were." "I understand that. I wasn't part of anything Knox was doing. I want you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. "I know you weren't, Captain." Something in his shoulders dropped slightly. Not relief exactly, but something older than relief. "Is there anything my team can do?" he said. "For the assessment." "Yes, actually." She turned to a page in her notebook. "I need access to the physical manifest records from the last 2 quarterly cycles, not the digital copies, the originals. There are discrepancies between the digital records and the physical records in 3 categories of equipment, and I need to trace where the divergence started." Saunders looked at her. "Physical manifests from 2 quarters ago are in the lower records room. Nobody's touched those in..." "I know. Can you authorize access?" "Yes." He pulled out his phone and made a note. "I'll have it set up tomorrow morning." "Thank you." He stood. At the door he paused. The same kind of pause that kept happening at the edges of conversations with her. The pause of someone who had one more thing and wasn't sure of the ground under it. "Monday morning," he said, "in the dining hall. Before everything..." I walked by on my way to my table. I saw Knox go over to yours. He looked at the door frame. I kept walking. She waited. I shouldn't have, he said. The office was quiet. No, she said. You shouldn't have. He nodded once. He left. She heard his footsteps go down the corridor and diminish, and then she looked at her notebook and found the place where she'd stopped and started over from the beginning of the logic chain. The formal review convened at 900 the following morning in the main conference room adjacent to Holloway's office. Standard format: complainant, subject, command representative, recorder. Chen was present as executive officer. A JAG officer named Captain Lila Park, who had driven in from the regional legal office the previous evening, sat to Holloway's right with a tablet and a very organized folder. Knox came in with the right posture and the wrong energy. The posture was 11 years of military bearing, back straight, chin level, hands still. The energy underneath it was the energy of someone who had spent 48 hours watching a plan fail and had not yet found a new plan to replace it with. He sat across from Claire. She had the green notebook on the table in front of her but didn't open it. Park ran the procedural opening: review purpose, evidence scope, participant roles, record status. She had the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly and had no investment in the outcome beyond process accuracy. Knox listened without expression. Sergeant Knox, Park said, the footage from the dining facility reviewed by Commander Holloway and Major Chen on Wednesday night is inconsistent with the sequence of events described in your formal complaint. Specifically, the complaint states that the responding soldier, Colonel Morgan, initiated physical contact without provocation. The footage shows that you made contact with Colonel Morgan's tray prior to any physical response from her. Do you want to address that discrepancy? A pause. The contact with the tray was accidental, Knox said. The footage doesn't clearly support that characterization, Park said. Can you describe the sequence as you experienced it? Knox described it. He was careful, more careful than Danny Reyes would have expected from the man in the dining hall, more careful than Webb had been in the barracks. The Knox in this room had compressed himself into precise, clipped sentences that admitted only what the footage made unavoidable and attributed everything else to chaos and misinterpretation. Park listened. She made notes. She asked 4 clarifying questions, each one slightly more specific than the last, in the way of someone using precision to reduce the available space for interpretation. At the 4th question, when you stepped into Colonel Morgan's path after the tray fell, what was your intention? Knox stopped for a beat that was 1 beat too long. I was trying to continue the conversation, he said. What conversation? About her placement in the senior dining section. Was that conversation complete at the point when you stepped into her path? Another beat. I felt it wasn't. Did Colonel Morgan indicate she felt it was complete? Silence. Sergeant Knox. She said she needed to return her tray. And you stepped into her path. He stopped. He recalibrated. I was in the vicinity of her path. Park made a note without commentary. She turned to Claire. Colonel Morgan, do you want to add anything to the factual record at this point? No, Claire said. The footage is accurate. Is there anything you'd like to say about the physical response you made? Claire looked at the table for a moment. He blocked an exit route. I neutralized the blockage using controlled contact techniques consistent with my training. I did not cause injury. I disengaged immediately. She paused. If I had wanted to cause injury, the outcome would have been different. The room sat with that for a second. Knox's jaw moved slightly. I understand, Park said, in the tone of someone who genuinely did. Yet, the second part of the review was harder. Not harder for Claire, harder for the room. Park laid out the documentation audit, the complaint is filed, the signatures attached, the independent testimony from 7 witnesses, and then the cross-reference against what the footage showed. She went through it methodically and without drama, and the result was what it was, a formal complaint with 3 supporting signatures, 2 of which came from individuals who were in the dining facility during the incident and whose accounts aligned with Knox's rather than with the footage, and 1 of which, Fields came from an individual who had not been present. PFC Fields, Park said. His statement was included in the complaint documentation. He was not present during the incident. I know, Knox said. How was his statement obtained? Knox looked at the table. Webb spoke to him. Webb characterized the incident to Fields, and Fields signed a statement based on that characterization. Yes. Without direct observation. Yes. Park wrote something. That's a problem, she said simply. I understand. Do you understand why Fields signed? Knox looked up. The question had come from Claire, not Park. His eyes went to her and then to the table and then back, and the transit of that look contained something complicated. Not contrition, not anger, something in between those that didn't have a clean name. Because Webb told him to, Knox said. No, Claire said, because not signing felt more dangerous to him than signing. Knox was quiet. He's been on this installation 6 months, she said. He's in the social structure you built in the North Barracks. Refusing Webb would have cost him something he wasn't ready to lose. She looked at Knox steadily. That's yours, not his. The conference room held a very specific kind of silence, the kind that formed when something accurate was said in a space that hadn't expected it to be said that directly. Holloway had been quiet through most of the review. He spoke now. Sergeant Knox, he said, the formal outcome of this review will be documented and entered into your service record. Administrative hold continues pending the findings. Supervisory authority remains suspended. He paused. Those are the institutional responses. I want to be clear that they are separate from the question I'm asking you now, which is not institutional. Knox looked at him. Do you understand what you actually did? Not what the footage showed, not what the complaint said, what he actually did. The distinction was precise and Knox heard it. He sat with it for a long moment, long enough that the recorder was still running and picking up the silence and the climate system in the ceiling and nothing else. I targeted someone I thought had no protection, Knox said. Yes. And I was wrong about the protection. Holloway let that sit for a second. You were wrong about more than the protection. Knox looked at the table. Dismissed, Sergeant. Knox stood. He picked up the folder he'd brought in, which was now irrelevant, and he walked to the door with the same careful posture he'd come in with. And he left, and the door closed, and Park exhaled through her nose and made a final note and closed her tablet. Fields came in at 10:45. He was in his duty uniform, and he sat in the chair across from Park with his hands flat on the table, which was the posture of someone who had decided in advance not to fidget. He looked younger than 21. Claire had noticed that on Monday, and she noticed it again now. Park walked him through the same procedural opening. Fields listened. When she finished, he spoke before she asked the first question. I wasn't there, he said. I signed a statement about an incident I didn't see. Park looked at him. Why? Webb told me what happened, and I didn't ask for the footage or talk to anyone else who was there. He paused. I trusted the account because it came from inside the group I was in, and I signed because refusing would have... He stopped. He was picking his words. It would have been a problem. What kind of problem? The kind that makes 6 months feel like 6 years. Park wrote something. Claire said nothing. Holloway watched the private across the table. PFC Fields, Holloway said, signing a statement you know to be based on second-hand information is a serious issue. Yes, sir, I know that. Do you want to formally recant the statement? Fields looked at him. Yes, sir. On the record. Yes, sir. On the record. Park pulled a form. Fields signed it with the kind of steadiness that came not from confidence, but from having already crossed a line in his own head hours before he arrived in the room. When he was done, he set the pen down and looked at Claire for the first time since entering. She was already looking at him. I'm sorry, he said. Not to the room, to her. She held his gaze for a moment. Noted, she said. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold. It was what it was. An acknowledgement from someone who had been watching him since Monday and had already accounted for this moment in her evaluation of who he was. He nodded. He stood. At the door he paused in the same way everyone seemed to pause at doors in conversations with her. Was it obvious, he said, that I hadn't been there? Yes, she said. He took that. He left. By afternoon, the base had finished the loud part of processing what had happened and moved into the quieter part, which was harder and took longer. The loud part was the assembly, the rumor correction, the revision of the story in real time. The quiet part was what people did alone with the revision, how they held it against what they'd done during the 2 days when the story was different, and what that comparison told them about themselves. Danny Reyes did this sitting in the vehicle depot break room at 13:30 with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He'd been present in the dining hall. He hadn't laughed. He'd watched. He'd done nothing to stop it. He'd followed up afterward with the woman, twice, in ways that were genuine but also partly self-serving, the way concern sometimes was when it was also curiosity, and also the need to locate yourself on the right side of something. He didn't think he'd done enough. He wasn't sure what enough would have looked like. Gallo came in at 13:35 and poured himself coffee and looked at Danny and said, "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you sit and look at the wall and pretend the coffee's interesting." Danny looked at his cup. "I was there Monday morning." "I know." "I didn't do anything." "You didn't laugh," Gallo said. "That's a low bar." "Yeah." Gallo sat down across from him. "It is." He drank his coffee. "You also talked to her twice, on your own. You told me what you saw without changing any of it." He paused. "I'm not saying it adds up to something great, but it's not nothing." Danny looked at the window. "She found 3 weeks of supply chain failure in 45 minutes. I heard. And she didn't tell anyone who she was. She just sat in the corner and worked." "I know. What does that say about—" He stopped. He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "About how we run things here. That someone like that can walk in and spend 2 days looking like nobody, and nobody checks." Gallo was quiet for a moment. "It says we see what we expect to see." "Yeah." And she knew that. She came in knowing that. Danny turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Webb's going to be reassigned. I heard from Stills. Stills is requesting transfer out of the North Barracks." "Heard that too." "Fields is staying." "Good," Gallo said. He said it with simple finality, the way people said things they'd thought about and arrived at a conclusion on. "He's a decent person who made a bad call. That's fixable." Danny nodded. "Knox isn't," Gallo said. "Fixable, I mean. Not here. Maybe somewhere. But not here." They sat with that. Outside the break room window, the depot was running its afternoon cycle. Vehicles moving out and back. Maintenance crews working the second bay. The ordinary, steady operations of a place that continued regardless of what was happening inside it. Claire was in the secondary office at 1600 when Holloway stopped in. He didn't knock, which she'd told him in 2019 he didn't need to do, and he apparently still remembered. He came in, looked at the filing cabinet, looked at the contingency plan spread across her desk, looked at the green notebook. "How many pages?" he said. 17. 6 weeks is going to be tight. "I know." She didn't look up from the page she was on. "I'll need access to the battalion-level planning documents. The contingency plan references them, but doesn't include them. Chen can set that up. And I need about 45 minutes with Saunders' team next week. Formal debrief on the documentation gap and the authorization protocol failure. Not punitive, educational. I'll schedule it." He pulled the second chair out from the wall and sat in it, which he also hadn't asked permission for, and she didn't comment on, which was a shorthand between people who'd worked in close enough proximity that certain social formalities had become noise. "How are you?" he said. She looked up from the page. It was a genuine question, not operational, not professional, the question that proceeded both with a human check, and she recognized it as such. "Tired," she said. "You slept?" "Some." "That means no." "It means some." She set down her pen. The contingency plan has a section on base lockdown procedures that references a radio protocol that was discontinued in 2021. If there's ever a scenario where someone tries to run that procedure under stress, they're going to be broadcasting on a dead channel. Holloway looked at her. "That's what you're thinking about at 1600 after a formal review." "The review is done. The radio protocol isn't fixed." He was quiet for a moment. You know, most colonels who'd spent 2 days being mocked in a mess hall would spend at least an afternoon on something other than base contingency planning. Most colonels weren't here for the contingency planning. You were here for both, he said. The assessment and the... He searched for the word. Observation, she said. Observation. She picked up her pen. The assessment is more useful. And the observation? She looked at her notebook. It confirmed what the request indicated. The culture issues are real, specific, addressable. She paused. Knox is a symptom. The documentation gaps are a symptom. The fact that 3 weeks of supply chain failure went unfound is a symptom. They're all the same problem from different angles. Which is, information doesn't move to where it's needed because the people who have it and the people who need it aren't looking at each other. She turned a page. The hierarchy works as a filter. Things go up and come back down changed. Junior personnel learn to read the filter instead of the problem, so everyone optimizes for the filter. Holloway sat with that. You wrote this up? He said. Page 4 through 8 of the notebook. I need a formal version. You'll have it. He stood. He looked at the contingency plan, the notebook, the cold coffee at the edge of the desk that she'd apparently made at some point and not touched. Claire, he said. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for running it the way you ran it, coming in the way you did. He paused. I know it wasn't comfortable. She looked at him for a moment. Comfortable wasn't the assignment, she said. He almost smiled. He left, and she heard his footsteps in the corridor, and she turned back to the radio protocol section and found her place and kept working, and the office was quiet except for the ventilation and the occasional flicker of the light above her, and outside the single window the depot ran its afternoon cycle, and none of it required her to stop. The radio protocol section took her another hour and 20 minutes. She found 2 more discontinued references buried in the appendices. One for a command frequency that had been reallocated in 2022, one for an emergency notification chain that referenced a position that no longer existed on the base organizational chart. She noted both with precise language and cross-referenced them against the current communications directory she'd pulled from the shared system. By 1730, the desk had acquired a second layer of paper around the contingency plan, the communications directory, a 2-year-old organizational chart, and the physical manifest discrepancy notes from her visit to the lower records room that morning. She hadn't eaten since 11:30. She noticed this the way you noticed weather, as a fact that existed and would eventually require a response. She capped her pen. She looked at page 17 of the green notebook. Then she looked at the window where the depot outside had gone quiet in the way it went quiet after the afternoon cycle ended and before the evening maintenance crews came on. She thought about the radio protocol broadcasting on a dead channel. She thought about Knox's complaint broadcasting into a room where the receiver had already been changed. Then she stopped thinking about Knox, because she'd spent enough of the last 4 days with Knox occupying space in her head, and he'd been given more real estate there than he'd earned. And she closed the green notebook and stood up and went to get food before the mess hall stopped serving. The weeks that followed did not move dramatically. They moved the way institutional change moved, in increments with friction, 2 steps of progress, and 1 step of something stubborn and resistant that had to be worked around rather than through. Claire's formal designation as Logistics Infrastructure Assessment Officer had been distributed through the base communication channels on the evening of the assembly, which meant that by the following morning, everyone on Redstone Valley knew who was in the secondary office on the east side of the logistics building. The adjustment this required from the base's social architecture was significant and visible in small ways. The way people held doors, the way conversations paused when she entered a room, the way Captain Saunders' team organized the conference table when she came in for the debrief she'd requested. She noticed all of it and found most of it less useful than the 2 days when nobody had adjusted anything for her at all. The debrief with Saunders' team was the 3rd week. She ran it herself, which Saunders had offered to do and she'd declined. She stood at the whiteboard in the coordination office conference room with the timeline of the supply chain failure drawn out in 3 colors, the distribution update in blue, the receiving log gap in red, the inquiry chain in black, and she walked Yates and Diaz and the 3 other members of the team through exactly what had happened and why and where every piece of it had broken down. Yates sat with her arms crossed for the first 10 minutes. Not defensively. The posture of someone bracing for something they expected to be uncomfortable. Claire did not make it a humiliation. She made it a map. The failure was systemic, she said, pointing at the blue line on the board. This update should have gone to base-level coordination teams. It didn't. That's a distribution protocol issue at the hub level, not a detection failure at your level. You couldn't have found what you didn't know to look for. Yates uncrossed her arms. Slightly. What you can do going forward, Claire said, is build a cross-check step into the quarterly authorization review. 15 minutes every quarter. You pull the hub admin update log and compare it against your own protocol list. If there's a new requirement in the hub log that isn't in your protocol list, you flag it before it creates a gap. That's it. 15 minutes. Diaz looked at the board. We could automate part of that. System flag when the hub log updates. Yes, Claire said. That's better. Talk to Saunders about getting IT to build it. Diaz wrote something. Any questions? Claire said. Yates raised her hand. Not the military hand raise, the human one. The manual records discrepancy you mentioned, the equipment categories. Yes. How far back does it go? 2 years at minimum, possibly 3. I'm still working through it. Do you know what caused it? Not yet. I have a theory. I need one more set of physical records to confirm or rule it out. She looked at Yates. When I know, I'll bring it here first. Yates nodded. Not warmly. Yates was not a warm person in professional settings, which Claire had identified in the first week as a management communication issue and a personal integrity asset simultaneously. She didn't perform rapport, she just did the work. Okay, Yates said. That was in its way. Enough. Gone. Knox left Redstone Valley on a Tuesday, 5 weeks in. His formal outcome had come through 10 days after the review. Administrative reassignment pending the service record flag, removal from supervisory roles, mandatory counseling requirement before any future supervisory designation. It wasn't a discharge. The military processed these things on a spectrum, and where Knox landed was not at the terminal end. He was transferred to a logistics support installation 3 states away, a base that was smaller, quieter, and without the social infrastructure he'd spent 11 years building. The transfer orders were standard. The flag on his service record was not. Danny Reyes heard about the transfer from Gallo, who heard it from the admin wing on the morning it happened. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel. He thought he'd feel satisfied. Instead, he felt something flatter and more complicated. The specific texture of a situation resolving into its actual shape, which was never as clean as the shape you'd imagined for it. He went to the coordination office in the logistics building because he had a vehicle requisition form to drop off with Diaz. While he was there, he looked at Claire's office door down the corridor, closed, light on underneath it, and he stood with the form in his hand for a moment. Then he went to the door and knocked. "Come in." He came in. She looked up from the desk. "Private Reyes," she said. "What do you need?" "Nothing, actually. I was in the building." He held up the requisition form. "Us. Diaz." She nodded. He didn't leave. "Knox transferred this morning," he said. "I know." "How do you feel about it?" She considered the question with the same honest weight she'd given every question he'd ever asked her, which was the thing he'd noticed first about her, that she didn't deflect. "Indifferent," she said, which is accurate and probably sounds colder than I mean it. She set down her pen. He made his choices. The outcome follows the choices. My feelings about it don't change the math. Doesn't it matter that what he did to you? What he did told me things I needed to know about this installation. In that sense, it served its purpose. She looked at him. I'm not saying it was acceptable. I'm saying it had a use I didn't have to manufacture. Danny thought about that. That's a hard way to live, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something passed across her face. Not offense, not dismissal. Something that was briefly and genuinely considering his observation. Sometimes, she said. He nodded. He went to leave. Reyes. He turned. The vehicle depot scheduling log has an authorization gap similar to the supply chain one. Different category. Maintenance cycle approval, not procurement. You might mention it to Gallo. Danny blinked. You found another one. I found the pattern. The gaps are in the same class of documentation update from 2022. There are probably 3 or 4 more across the base. Are you going to... I'm writing it up. But someone in each department needs to run the local verification. Gallo would be good at it. Danny looked at her. He thought about the green notebook. He thought about the corner table and the back-to-wall seating and the first morning when 300 people had watched Knox knock over her tray and she'd stood up and collected the pieces with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had more important things to do than react to that. Why Gallo? He said. Because he asks the right questions, she said, and he doesn't need credit for the answer. She went back to her notebook. Danny left and went down to find Diaz and then went back to the depot and told Gallo what she'd said, word for word, and Gallo sat with it for a minute and then pulled up the maintenance cycle authorization log and started running the cross-check. And 2 hours later, he found the gap. The physical manifest discrepancy resolved in week 5. It took her 4 sessions in the lower records room, 3 conversations with Saunders, 1 with Chen, and 1 phone call to a warrant officer at the Regional Supply Command who confirmed the 2021 documentation transition she suspected was the root cause. The discrepancy had been generated by a conversion error during a digital records migration. Not intentional, not negligent in the conventional sense, but the product of a migration that had been executed faster than the verification process could keep up with. The result was a 2-year inventory record that was accurate in aggregate and inaccurate in specific categories, which meant base-level planning had been working with slightly wrong numbers for equipment availability in 3 maintenance-dependent vehicle classes. She wrote it up in a formal findings document, 19 pages, clean, with a recommendation section that was specific about process changes and agnostic about blame. She submitted it to Holloway through Chen. Holloway read it and called her. Page 14, he said, the maintenance scheduling gap. You're recommending a full cycle audit. Yes. That's 6 weeks of additional work for the depot teams. Yes. A pause. They're not going to love that. No, she said. But it's necessary, and it's better than finding the gap during an operational scenario when you need those vehicles and 3 of them aren't where the record says they are. Another pause. The recommendations in here. Number 7. Cross-departmental documentation review, quarterly. You're asking me to institutionalize a process that didn't exist before you found 4 separate gaps. Yes, she said, because the gaps weren't anomalies. They were the product of a system that assumes the documentation is accurate until someone proves it isn't. I'm recommending you invert that assumption. Assume it's wrong until you confirm it's right. Assume it needs regular verification. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. How long would this take to implement? Chen could have the framework drafted in 2 weeks if you give her the authority to pull department heads into it. And you? I'll be gone by then, she said. The phone was quiet. Week 6 ends Friday, she said. I know when it ends. She waited. You could stay, he said. Not as a commander. As a person who had been doing this long enough to know which requests to make as a commander and which ones to make as a person. I have another assignment, she said. Where? You know I can't tell you that. I know, he said. I asked anyway. She was quiet. Claire, he said, for what it's worth, this base is in better shape than it was 6 weeks ago. That's not a small thing. The work isn't finished. It never is. That's not the same thing as what I said. She looked at the wall of the secondary office, the filing cabinet, the chair nobody used, the single window with the depot outside, which she'd looked at so many times in 6 weeks, it had become part of her sense of where she was. I know, she said. The last Friday was an ordinary morning. The mess hall ran its usual cycle. The serving line opened at 05:45. Fluorescent lights, steam vents, coffee smell, concrete floors, the overlapping rhythms of 300 people who had learned to exist in close proximity and had developed all the invisible systems that proximity required. Claire came through the east entrance at 06:20. She was in the same plain service uniform she'd worn on the first morning. Different shirt, but same rank presentation, same worn quality, same absence of decoration beyond the ribbon bar that nobody had looked twice at on the first day, and that several people had since looked up and found carried more information than the bare metal suggested. She went through the serving line. She took whatever was at the front. She went to the corner table. She sat with her back to the wall and her coffee in front of her and the green notebook, now filled, every page, cover to final leaf, on the table beside the tray. The room was different from the first morning. Not completely. It still had all the noise and momentum of an institution that ran on schedule regardless of what had happened inside it. But the table formation had shifted. The invisible social architecture had reorganized around a different center of gravity, or more accurately, it had become slightly less organized around a single center of gravity and slightly more distributed, which was a healthier structure even if it was less legible from the outside. She noticed this. She noted it in the finished notebook's final pages, not as a conclusion, but as a data point. Institutions didn't change in 6 weeks. They shifted. The shift was real, and the shift was fragile. And whether the shift held depended on whether the people who remained kept making the choices that had generated it. That was outside her control. She knew that. She'd made peace with it a long time ago on a different base in a different situation, and the peace was genuine, if imperfect, because making peace with the limits of what you could change didn't mean you stopped feeling the weight of what remained. Yates came in at 06:35 and scanned the room and stopped when she saw Claire, and did something she had never done in 6 weeks of professional interaction. She came over to the corner table and stood there. "Morning," Yates said. "Morning." Yates set her tray on the adjacent table. Not Claire's table, the adjacent one, which was the precise distance of a person who had something to say and wasn't sure whether to sit down to say it. "I heard you're leaving today," Yates said. "Yes." Yates looked at her tray. She had the posture of someone fighting between the version of herself that communicated in professional shorthand and the version that sometimes, reluctantly, didn't. "The 15-minute cross-check," she said. "Diaz is already building the system flag. I know, he told me. It's a good solution." "It's his solution," Claire said. "I gave him the problem. He built the solution." Yates looked at her. "That's generous. It's accurate." Yates was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about you, at the beginning. You didn't know me at the beginning. I judged without knowing, that's what I mean." She said it flatly, without self-pity, in the way of someone for whom honesty was a practiced discipline rather than a natural comfort. "I saw you solve the supply chain thing, and I felt embarrassed instead of asking how you found it. You asked eventually." 3 days later. "Still counts," Claire said. Yates looked at her. Something passed between them that wasn't warmth exactly. Too professional for warmth, too human for professional. But that was real, and both of them recognized it as such. "Good luck," Yates said, "with wherever you're going." "You too." Yates picked up her tray and went to her usual table and sat down and put her headphones in, and Claire watched her for a moment and thought that the headphones would probably come out earlier now than they had before. Small things, but real ones. Danny Reyes found her at 07:15 in the east corridor near the logistics building, carrying a single bag. He was coming from the vehicle depot, and she was walking toward the administrative processing wing, and they met at the intersection the same way they'd met in the corridor 5 weeks ago, unexpectedly turning a corner. "Today," he said. "Yes." He had nothing in his hands, and his pockets were empty, and he stood in the corridor with the specific helplessness of someone who had things to say and no container for them. I know it wasn't." He stopped, tried again. "I keep thinking about the first morning, what I didn't do." "We've had this conversation," she said. "I know, I keep having it with myself. That's different from having it with me." She looked at him. "What are you actually asking?" He was quiet for a second. "Whether it mattered, that I didn't do more." She considered this, not quickly. "Yes," she said, "and no." That's not an answer. It's both answers because both are true. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. It mattered because you were there and someone needed to say something, and the cost of saying it was low enough that you could have paid it. That's real. A pause. It didn't matter in the sense that the outcome would have been the same. The situation was going to resolve the way it resolved regardless. So it was a test? No. She shook her head. It wasn't a test. I wasn't watching to evaluate you. I was watching because that's how you understand a place. You watch what people do when they think the cost of doing the right thing is higher than it actually is. And what did you see? She looked at him directly. Someone who didn't do enough on Monday and has been thinking about it honestly ever since. Which is more than most people manage. Danny held that. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to be accurate, she said. Whether it makes you feel better is your decision. He almost laughed. It came out as a breath. Will you... He stopped. Can I ask where you're going? No? Right. He looked at the corridor wall. Will you be at another base doing the same thing? She looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite not. Probably, she said. He nodded slowly. He extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm, brief, and entirely professional, and she let go and picked up her bag. Take care of yourself, Private Reyes, she said. You too, Colonel. She walked down the east corridor toward the admin processing wing, and he stood where he was and watched her go, and she didn't look back, and the corridor lights ran above her in their steady fluorescent row, and she turned the corner and was gone. Fields found the note under his door at 800. It was written on a page torn from a green spiral notebook. The handwriting was precise and slightly compressed, like someone who wrote fast and had trained themselves to keep it legible anyway. It read, P.F.C. Fields. The formal record reflects your recantation. What's not in the record is that you made the decision before you came in. I noticed. That's the part that matters. Morgan. He read it twice. He sat on the edge of his bunk with it in his hands. He was 21 years old and had been on his first installation for 6 months and had made a serious mistake with low information and high social pressure, and he had corrected it without being forced to. That was the factual record. The note in his hands said someone had seen the correction and considered it meaningful, and that was the kind of information that stayed with a person, not as absolution, but as a reference point. Proof that the version of himself that had recanted existed and was observable from the outside. He folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He went to breakfast. Holloway was at his desk at 0900 when Chen told him the East Wing transport had signed out at 0847. Yes, he said. The formal assessment report is filed. Recommendations are on your desk. I've read them. Chen stood in the doorway. She had known Holloway long enough to read the particular quality of his stillness, when it was operational and when it was something else. She fixed a lot, Chen said. She identified a lot, Holloway said. We fix it. Chen considered that distinction. Fair. He looked at the window. The quarterly cross-check. Push it to department heads by end of week. I want implementation confirmed before the next inspection cycle. Yes, sir. And Yates. Give her the authorization to run the documentation audit independently going forward. She doesn't need to route through Saunders for that specific function. That's a role expansion. Yes, he said. It is. Chen made a note. At the door, she left a correction in the contingency plan. Appendix D radio protocols. I found a sticky note this morning. Fix it. Already sent it to comms. He almost smiled. Chen left. He looked at the secondary envelope in his desk drawer. He'd put it back after the review, protocol, and thought about Claire Morgan sitting in the corner table on the first morning, writing in a green notebook while 300 people arranged themselves around the story Knox was telling about her. And the story was wrong, and she knew it was wrong, and she sat there and wrote anyway because the story was temporary and the work was not. He thought about the 14 pages she'd filled before anyone knew who she was. He thought about the sticky note on Appendix D. He pulled the contingency plan from his stack and turned to Appendix D and read the correction in the margin. Precise, technical, 3 lines in compressed handwriting. And it was exactly right, as everything she'd touched had been exactly right in the way that things were right when they came from someone who had spent decades learning how to see what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. He closed the plan. Outside his window, the base was running on its ordinary morning. Vehicles in the depot. Personnel between buildings. A helicopter crossing northeast in the pale sky, its sound arriving a half second after the shape. Somewhere, a transport was moving along a road that would connect to a highway that would connect to an airport, or another base, or a staging facility, and inside that transport was a woman with a worn service uniform and a finished green notebook, and she was probably already looking at something, a briefing document, a map, a preliminary report for the next place. Because the work was continuous, and the place changed, and the work didn't. She would arrive somewhere quiet. She would sit with her back to the wall. She would watch. And whatever needed to be found in that place, she would find it, without announcement, without an audience, without needing the room to know who she was before she did what she came to do. Because the strongest proof of what you're worth isn't the moment everyone finally sees it. It's everything you built while they were looking somewhere else.